For many who claim alien abductions, it's a lonely road in trying to understand what has happened. Your loved ones, your friends, and those around you may not even believe you. Throughout my years of research and interviewing many claimed abductees or experiencers, it's often most difficult when it comes to a significant other supporting their partner's incredible claims. In fact, many times it can make or break a relationship. But what happens when it's more than one claimed abduction? And what happens when your significant other was there when more than one of these experiences occurred? These are the abductions of Denise Stoner.
I look over at Ed, and he's frozen to the steering wheel. I can't get his attention whatsoever. He's just frozen. They are bringing me away and up into the craft.
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
It was August 13th, 1982, Colorado. Denise Stoner, along with her husband Ed and their teenage daughter, were on their way to a vacation retreat at the Grace Acre Ranch just outside of Denver. They had arranged to meet Stoner's parents as well as family friends at the retreat, with all of them going ahead of the Stoners. They expected to arrive there around 8:30 p.m., but Denise, her husband Ed, and their daughter would ultimately arrive much later than that. They had left Denver at around 5 p.m. and immediately took to the back roads in order to escape the rush hour traffic. By 6:30, they had arrived at Kenosha Pass, which not only gave Ed a chance to pull over and stretch his legs, but also offered fantastic views of the South Park Valley below. It was after Ed restarted the car and set off down Kenosha Pass that the evening took a drastic turn. While Stoner and Ed chatted as they drove toward Jefferson, their daughter slept in the back seat. It was as they passed through Jefferson that Stoner noticed two yellow-white lights in the sky. They appeared to be heading in their direction. Eventually, the lights were directly over the top of the car. Then, without warning, the car suddenly moved sideways off the road and into the desert surroundings. Stoner would recall,
It was as if the car was being dragged by some kind of invisible rope. We could do nothing at all to resist the pull.
all the while, the lights remained directly overhead. The next thing the family remembered was being out of the valley entirely, driving toward Trout Creek Pass.
It felt like only seconds had passed since we were pulled off the road. But it was no longer daylight. It was dark out, and now almost 11 p.m.
Ed quickly calculated that they had covered almost 40 miles with no memory of what had happened, and they had lost almost 4 hours. Even stranger, despite them being 40 miles from their previous location when the lights had arrived, the car's odometer had not registered those miles.
It was as if we'd been picked up and placed 40 miles down the road and set back on our way.
The Stoners couldn't help an unsettling feeling running through them as they continued on to the retreat, 90 minutes late and with no idea why. By the time they arrived at their destination, it was only 15 minutes before midnight. Stoner's parents and the family friends were at the roadside of the retreat, a mixture of anxiety and relief on their faces. They would tell them that they were contemplating calling the police and filing a missing persons report.
We decided we had no other option but to tell our worried family exactly what had happened.
Although they initially thought this could have been some sort of elaborate prank, the rest of the family and family friends realized that whatever had happened, it had truly terrified and mystified the Stoners. Following the weekend away, the Stoners returned home to Denver.
I contemplated that night in my mind for many years, coming to no conclusions as to what happened during that missing time with my family.
It wouldn't be until almost 3 decades later until Stoner spoke of that night again. She would meet a woman by the name of Kathleen Martin, who would ultimately change Denise's life forever. Kathleen Martin had earned a degree in social work from the University of New Hampshire. She also participated in graduate studies in education while working as a teacher and education services coordinator. She also spent time volunteering at the New Hampshire State Psychiatric Hospital. Martin was a dedicated individual, a lifelong learner, even while she passed on her knowledge to others. She would spend the next 15 years in the education system, and while her work as an educator always shone bright, and she was well known for it, Martin was also known for something else. She was the niece of Betty Hill, the wife of Barney Hill. This married couple would arguably not only be some of the first individuals to have claimed to have had a close encounter with a UFO, but also to have been abducted by the supposed non-human pilots of the UFO. Here is Martin summarizing the initial close encounter of her aunt and uncle that harrowing night in 1961.
Betty had a vacation from her job as a social worker for the state of New Hampshire. Barney worked for the post office. Neither believed in UFO reality at that time. They had never read a book on the topic. They took a brief vacation to Niagara Falls, onto Toronto, onto Montreal, and they were driving home through the White Mountains of New Hampshire on September 19, 1961, when they had a close encounter with a UFO. It came so close that it was within 100 feet, estimated by them, of their location. Barney got out of the car with his binoculars. He looked up at it, and according to the Air Force report and the report that they made to the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, very shortly thereafter, they observed a craft that was approximately 100 feet above them. It was extremely large. They told the Air Force that it was as large as a dinner plate at arm's length. This was very close to them. It was observed by at least a dozen additional people. It was on radar on the Air Force's 2 radar stations, and a follow-up study by the Air Force stated that this was a bona fide sighting.
Eventually, it would be revealed that both Betty and Barney Hill believed that they had suffered missing time during this event, and that they had been kidnapped by something non-human that night. Naturally, the story of this interracial couple in the 60s drew a lot of attention when it was leaked to the public, and it became one of the most well-documented, investigated, and most famous alien abduction cases in UFO history. Martin, having been a witness to the aftermath of the events as a child with her aunt and uncle, stood by their testimony. She would eventually become the foremost investigator on the incident, and one of the leading researchers on the alien abduction phenomenon in general, even up until today. Martin and her husband had relocated from New Hampshire to Florida in 2009. Soon after, Martin began attending meetings for the local chapter of a civilian-run organization known as MUFON, the Mutual UFO Network. There, she met State Section Director and Chief Investigator Denise Stoner. Apparently, the experiences of Stoner had made a huge impact on her life. Even without having any answers, it was through MUFON that she would attempt to find those answers, with the help of Martin.
I asked Kathleen Martin if she would be willing to look into my case and perhaps find some answers to fill in the gaps of missing time my family and I had experienced.
Stoner and Martin began a working relationship from that moment on. Martin agreed to investigate Stoner's incident, which would ultimately involve hypnotic regression of Stoner in order to attempt to unlock some of the memories that may have been pushed into the deepest corners of Stoner's mind. The first session would take place on July 7th of 2011. Martin would take Stoner back to the night of August 13th, 1982, when she and her family were driving down that darkened road in Colorado. She would soon recall the strange lights she had noticed in the sky coming toward them. Under hypnosis, Stoner stated,
"There were 3 big lights off in the valley. They're coming down to the valley ground. They don't look right. There are no roads out there."
When Martin asked Stoner to describe the lights further, she responded,
"They are huge, bright and white. They're rotating slowly. They're attached to another object. They look like 2 plates surrounding the light."
The lights were directly over the top of their vehicle. At this point, the car began to move sideways. Stoner instinctively looked into the back seat to see if her daughter was awake for the sudden movement, but she remained asleep.
"I'm now outside of the car. The lights are separating from the plates and are coming down to the ground. I can sense someone else there, but I couldn't see them. All I know is I'm supposed to go into the center of the lights."
Then, an already bizarre and unnerving situation took another drastic turn.
There's this glob of lighted jelly. It's twice the size of my head. It's floating toward me. The plates are a craft of some sort. It's lowering to the ground. Now there's this black, obsidian-colored opening, this craft. It's shaped like an hourglass. I know I'm supposed to step into this opening, but I'm afraid. But I do. I step into it. As soon as I do, I'm sucked into it. And I'm in it. I'm inside the craft.
Stoner then recalled that the jelly-like substance was now completely gone, and that she was in a room surrounded by slick, silver walls. The lighting inside the room was dim, and she couldn't see where it came from. As she looked around the room, she was startled when she noticed several figures in the room. As she moved toward them, she realized that whatever they were not human.
They're gray, small. They have huge black misty eyes. They have no clothes on. They're in a perfect line, shoulder to shoulder, staring straight ahead and not moving. Something tells me they're soldiers of some kind.
As she looked on at these beings, another figure soon came from around a corner of a curve in the room and was heading toward her. It bent down to her level.
It's much taller than the others. Its eyes are blinking vertically. It puts its face close to mine and it blinks, but its eyelids blink vertically. The eyes are yellow, tall, and narrow more to the side of its head than in front. It has no nose and a tiny red mouth. It has 3 long fingers and 1 thumb. Its body is oddly jointed and extremely thin. Around its fragile frame, it wore a dark jacket that reached down to its legs. It has a stand-up collar like a priest wears. Its mouth doesn't move, but it's speaking to me. Not verbally. It's in my mind. Talking to me inside my head somehow. We have to go in. But I don't want to. I want to go back to my car. It tells me you can't go back until I do what I have to do.
It was at this point in Stoner's session that she became very anxious and scared, and Martin opted to end the session. The next hypnotic regression would take place several months later, on October 26, 2011. However, before it would take place, Stoner informed Martin of several details she had managed to recall consciously since their last meeting. For example, She would claim that despite how terrifying the taller being was to her, she could sense it was highly intelligent. She had further recalled that when the car moved sideways, it was in fact lifted several feet from the ground. She also recalled passing by a nearby ranch when they went. She couldn't recall how or why she got out of the vehicle, but she was certain that her husband and daughter all remained inside. However, it was when Martin took Stoner back to where they had left off in their last session where some of the most remarkable recollections allegedly came to light.
I'm following this being into the room as instructed. In this room there are several other beings identical to this one. It's saying something to me again in my head. It wants me to get on the table in the middle of the room. They have to perform a test on me. I'm reluctant, but I do it.
What happened next was invasive and highly traumatic. The being lifted the cuff off the jeans on Stoner's right ankle. The next thing she recalled was feeling a sting in her foot, like a long needle or wire had been directly inserted into her leg and into her vein.
The being tells me that the wire will remain in place for a period of time, and that it will be there so the ones on Earth will be able to recognize me.
Following this, a strange instrument appeared from behind the being, and the being then used it to place something inside of Stoner's tear duct.
It's like a little white bead. It's being put into my eye by some sort of metal pinchers with a point at the end. The being is telling me it will fall out in a few days.
The being then took a diamond-shaped instrument and pushed it down on Stoner's abdomen. According to Stoner, when the instrument passed over where her ovaries were, it caused a burning sensation.
I ask what the purpose of this test is for, and the being tells me that it is not for me to know, and that I'm part of the whole.
Stoner would also recall a strange 3D holographic type of technology that displayed pictures of Earth and other far-off planets. The being would also make her aware that they had visited her many times before, of which she had absolutely no memory of. Martin ended this session and picked up again on November 4th, 2011. During this session, Martin managed to extract some intricate descriptions of the craft itself by Stoner.
I'm in a room with its own atmosphere. It feels like it wants to spin, but it's not. The room is almost in complete blackness apart from a pole that goes from the ceiling to the floor. There's a mechanical device wrapped around the pole and 2 arms that come out on each side. This device, it seems, alive. It's in motion. I think it's operating the craft.
Following this, the being took Stoner out of the strange and disorienting room. As soon as she left the room, she felt as if she had just left something that was pressurized. It was at this point that Stoner blacked out and found herself back in the vehicle with her family. But this wasn't the only experience Stoner had with missing time, as Martin would soon learn. Something happened to Stoner and her husband on the other side of the United States, almost a decade later. Martin would once again put Stoner under to attempt to retrieve the memories of an event that occurred on October 20th, 1991. On the day in question, Stoner and her husband Ed had spent the day diving in a lake in Florida and were traveling back to their motel, the Steamboat Dive Inn. It was a route that they had taken many times before, and should see them arrive at their motel in a little over 15 minutes. After eating dinner, the Stoners called it a night and went to bed, looking forward to another day of diving in the morning. However, the night would bring with it another strange event. For reasons she couldn't explain, in the middle of the night, Stoner got out of bed, dressed, and made her way to their vehicle outside the motel. Although she wasn't entirely sure where she was going, and struggled to later recall exactly where she had been, she made her way to a very remote location. This is where the memory ended, and where the hypnosis session began. Stoner recalled heading away from the motel and down a lonely, dark road. She would eventually pull over at the roadside on a little dirt road in between two trees.
I can see an opening between the trees. There's a strange object there that I can't quite make out. It looks almost like the top of a water tower, but very low to the ground.
She remained in the car, her attention drawn toward the two trees in front of her. Stoner slowly crept the car closer to this object to get a better look. The closer she got, the more she realized this was not a water tower or anything like that. There was a ramp stretching out from the opening, and at the top of the ramp, a tall figure. As Stoner peered upward at the tall being, two small gray figures emerged from the opening and headed straight towards her. With ease, they were able to remove Stoner from her car, taking her up the ramp and into the opening. And once again, she found herself in a strange room, although this time there was no table. It was simply an empty room, except for a odd-looking chair.
I feel dazed, almost like a dreamy type feeling. The small beings place me in this chair. The tall being is approaching me. I notice that there is something that resembles a staple gun almost, and it's attached to the chair. The tall being takes this device or gun and presses it against the side of my head. It feels like it's stapling me.
With that, the two gray figures took her from the chair and proceeded to bring her back to her car. Then, things became even stranger as she recalled what she believed to have been the craft.
It's dark all around me except for this gray diamond with rounded edges. Bright red lights on those edges. Whatever this is, it's spinning. Faster! Faster! It's taking off in the sky. It disappears. Next thing I remember, I'm on the side of the road in the car. I don't remember the ride home. All I remember is returning to the motel and climbing into the bed. But when I look at the pillowcase, there's blood on it.
Incidentally, when this last detail is brought up to Martin during the regression, she did indeed examine the side of Stoner's head, and to her amazement and dismay, there was in fact a small staple-like scar where Stoner recalled the figure placing the device. And as it would soon turn out, Stoner wouldn't be the only one with a bizarre story being pieced together in her mind. These next memories would also involve her husband, Ed. The Stoners had planned to spend their final day diving, and after getting out of bed and eating breakfast at a nearby diner, they packed the equipment into the car and set out on their destination. However, as they approached a small farm on the roadside, things took an unsettling turn. At the very back of the barn on the farm, Stoner could see several oddly shaped objects. She quickly alerted Ed to these, asking what he thought they were. The closer they got to the barn, the objects appeared distinctly triangular shaped, and also appeared to have some kind of net-like covering over them. Ed responded that they were most likely chicken coops. Denise was not convinced, and asked that they go and take a closer look. Before they could, though, everything changed. Suddenly, instead of driving along the quiet road near the farmhouse, they found themselves near the interstate highway approaching Lake City. They would later work out that they were almost 30 miles from the farmhouse, and while half an hour had seemingly gone by, to them it appeared that they had arrived there in what seemed like an instant. They would turn their car around and head back in the direction of their original destination. They would eventually pass the barn, and, much to their confusion, the four strange triangular objects were no longer there. Both of them felt extremely unsettled, and each realized, at least in the back of their minds, that whatever had just happened was an echo of what they'd experienced in Colorado in 1982. Martin would also take statements from Ed to examine his version of these events. He would state the following.
We were driving along the quiet road near the farm and barn when Denise pointed out several strange objects in the field. I turned and saw these strange, shiny metal objects that came to a point. But within seconds of noticing them, I could suddenly see a sign for I-75 coming up in the distance. We were on a completely different stretch of road. I pulled over and told Denise, "It just happened to us again. It feels exactly the same as that night in Colorado."
Martin asked Ed if he'd agree to a hypnosis session, to which he did, and the alleged true events that happened in that missing time slowly came to the surface for Ed.
I see the shiny objects near the barn, and everything is becoming dark all around us. It feels like we're in some kind of vacuum. I turn to say something to Denise, and I realize she's not there. She's not in the car with me. I look out into the darkness, and there's this door opening. I see this tall figure, and it's carrying Denise in its long, skinny arms.
Ed then recalled this being bringing Denise to the car and literally dropping her into the passenger seat. Before he could react, the being returned to the doorway, which then closed, placing Ed and Denise in darkness. The next thing he knew, he was on the road approaching Lake City. Martin would perform one last regression with Denise Stoner in relation to this 1992 event. She would pick up in the car just after the two saw the object in the field.
I look over at Ed, and he's frozen to the steering wheel. I can't get his attention whatsoever. He's just frozen. And I see the tall being and the grays, the small ones. I'm floating, like there's no gravity. They are bringing me away and up into the craft.
Another interesting detail was Denise Stoner's response to Martin asking what had happened to the truck and where it had gone.
They're sending it away somewhere, almost like it's in a bubble that has no weight. Like they are pushing it away.
Shortly after noticing that she could no longer see the truck, Stoner saw the triangular craft in front of her and noted that she was being taken toward it. Martin then asked if she knew why they were taking her again.
It has something to do with the thing in my head. The tall being is examining the part of my head that he had placed the staple gun-like device to the night before. As he talks to me in my mind again, it's telling me not to be afraid and that I'll be taken back soon.
The next thing she realized, the car door was shut and the beings were gone. She would claim it was almost like a bubble popping. And then they were back on the road, and that's when they realized that they were going in the complete opposite direction, and that something truly strange had happened again. The work between Martin and Stoner continued, and as they dug deeper into her memories, it soon became clear, at least to them, that these experiences didn't begin in Colorado. They began when Stoner was a mere 2.5 years old and living in Hartford, West Virginia. On one particular evening, Stoner's mother was in the hospital about to give birth to Stoner's sister, and she was being cared for by her grandfather.
I'm looking out of a window at the house, and I see an egg-shaped object. I ask my grandfather why Humpty Dumpty was in the sky.
Her grandfather suddenly had a look of fear wash over him as he noticed the object she had pointed out. And at this point, he seemingly changed the subject and informed her that it was her bedtime. However, this was just the start of the evening's strange and unsettling events.
I'm lying in my room, and that's when I see it. There's this thing. This being that appears. But it's not coming through a door. It's coming straight through the wall.
This being was small. It was gray. It held a light of some sort in one hand and extended the other hand for Stoner to take it.
I feel no fear. I take its hand and start to follow it out of my room and down the hallway.
The being lifted the light it was carrying and pointed it directly at a wall in the hallway, walked toward the wall, and disappeared.
The next thing I know, I'm inside a large, dome-shaped room, and there's a lot of other children around me. It appears as if these beings are teaching something to the other children. What they're teaching? I have no idea.
Stoner's next memory is waking up in her bed the next morning. confused and terrified. And this was only the beginning, as Stoner would work with Martin to uncover many other experiences throughout her life with these beings. And perhaps it wasn't just she and Ed that these events had allegedly happened to. She recalled that her grandfather, during the initial experience at age 2, looked as though he knew what was happening and had some sort of scared yet familiar sense of the craft outside the home. Another event of interest was around the same time when Stoner was 2 years old, when she awoke one night to find that her baby sister was not in her crib. This would seemingly happen on several occasions, when her parents began noticing that their daughter was missing from her bed in the middle of the night, assuming she was escaping her crib and wandering downstairs. Her father placed a wooden fence of sorts around it using plywood. However, Stoner would recall that she knew this wouldn't work, as she had witnessed the tall being reaching into the crib and taking her sister with it. As her sister never seemed to come to any harm as a result of this, Stoner opted not to say anything to her parents. Another unsettling incident occurred several years later. Stoner would suddenly realize that instead of being in her bed at home, she was in a nearby park. When she looked around, she saw the tall being standing behind her. She noticed that it had a strange device that appeared to be attached to its arm. It appeared similar to an oil can, with a tube at the end that dripped a strange liquid toward the ground. Stoner suddenly became scared and turned to run, but as she did so, she believed she saw the being's arm extending, almost reaching her shoulder. By the time she had run a short distance to the corner of the park, the figure was in pursuit. Even worse, the arm with the tube reached her ear, and she felt a drop of the liquid fall inside. As it did so, a voice appeared in her mind, telling her that they would be able to keep track of her now as she got older. The next thing Stoner realized, she was back in her bed once more, and the early morning sun was beginning to rise. Although she couldn't explain what had happened, she knew that it wasn't a dream. Martin would examine several more of Stoner's experiences in her book, The Alien Abduction Files, and would come to some intriguing conclusions. She would perform a questionnaire study of 50 people who claimed that they had similar experiences to Denise Stoner, and many of the details fit well with Stoner's version of events. For example, many believe that they have been subject to abductions since childhood, and that the abductions have taken place regularly into adulthood. Similarly, many abductees, according to Martin's study, had been abducted when in the company of others, like a spouse, for example, and while they were largely unaware of what had taken place, they would often sense that something out of the ordinary had occurred. Again, many other claimed abductees could recall parts of the strange incidents, usually the beginning, and would often recall further details in dreams. And most could recall the majority of the encounters with the use of hypnosis. Even the details of the abductions can be found across many similar cases. The fact that some kind of examination had taken place, or that records of their examinations were maintained, and even that many of them were tracked, can all be found in many other abduction cases. Perhaps another intriguing detail is that many abductees, including Denise Stoner, noted that electronic equipment in their homes would suddenly malfunction in the days following an experience. In a similar detail, abductees would also note that strange paranormal activity followed such encounters, such as shadow figures, light orbs, and strange noises. Some even reported that items around the house simply went missing. There have even been reports of sudden psychic abilities that are often reported, if only temporary. Martin would also note that both Denise and Ed Stoner were honest, grounded, hard-working individuals who are considered by all who know them as credible people of excellent character. What's more, neither were seeking fame or fortune as a result of their claims. and conducted their side of the investigation away from the public eye until the publication of their accounts with Kathleen Martin. For many UFO researchers, the Denise Stoner incidents are some of the most detailed alleged alien abduction cases on record. Many of the details offered in their accounts resonate nicely with others that are on record in the research files of multiple investigators and researchers. Perhaps not least, that many alien abductees are subjected to repeat abductions throughout their lives, as well as the fact that immediate family members of these abductees are often also found to have been regularly abducted, with some cases stretching across generations. After examining the Denise Stoner accounts, what can we truly make of the reasons why these abductions took place? It appears, for example, that a certain amount of tracking and record keeping is taking place, hence the repeat abductions and procedures that make Stoner and other abductees recognizable to the intelligences behind the abductions. We also see a running pattern with those abducted being part of some kind of mass experimentation and monitoring operation. But to what ends? And if we are truly to ever come into contact with these captors on a mass scale, might we finally know the reasons they've done such traumatic things to humans? But perhaps even more importantly, if they can control us in the ways abductees claim, what will stop them from completely controlling us as an entire species? The answers to these incredible questions are unimaginable, just as the claims of Denise Stoner and many others are unimaginable as well. And once again, we find ourselves in the midst of compelling stories, but very little compelling evidence, save the highly controversial act of hypnosis having been conducted. And herein lay the most controversial aspect of the abduction phenomenon overall. How do you even begin to study something that refuses to rarely leave any physical imprint? How do you conduct an investigation when most of what is remembered was blacked out of the memory of the claimed abductee? And can we trust the memories that supposedly come to the surface? These are the understandable, inherent arguments by skeptics of the phenomenon. And one of those skeptics was John E. Mack. Mack was a psychiatrist and professor at Harvard. He was also a Pulitzer Prize-winning author. In 1994, he wrote a best-selling book titled Abduction: Human Encounters with Aliens. After looking heavily into the abduction phenomenon and interviewing those who claimed such experiences across a wide spectrum, he believed that most of them could not be explained by mental illness, sleep paralysis, seizures, or dreams, and that these individuals firmly believed these events happened to them. Mack spent years trying to unravel the mystery, coming to the same frustrating fact that perhaps the answers wouldn't be revealed through psychiatry, nor the sciences in general.
We're dealing with a phenomenon which violates our sense of reality and which operates in this gray area between the physical world and the subjective or mythic or other realm world. We're being asked to prove this by the methods of the physical sciences alone. But those methods, in my view, will not yield its secrets.
So here we are, even up until today, still questioning if the alien abduction phenomenon is actually happening or not. Especially for people like Denise and Ed Stoner. Either way, the experiences of the Stoners have become a part of UFO history, with the unfolding story continuing even up until today. And perhaps one day, Denise Stoner will find the answers to her questions somewhere in the skies. This episode was co-researched and written by Marcus Loth. To learn more, visit ufoinsight.com. Special thanks to Kathleen Martin and Denise Stoner. Much of the material in the making of this episode was inspired by their book, The Alien Abduction Files, the most startling cases of human-alien contact ever reported. Also, to our voiceover performers who contributed their time and talents to this episode, to Emily Tuckman and Jason McClellan. My special thanks to you both as well. You can learn more about Emily and Jason at the links in our show notes. If you haven't already, please take just a few moments to rate and review Somewhere in the Skies on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to the show. Please also subscribe to our YouTube channel as well for special live streams, case files, and so much more. You can find us on Twitter at Somewhere Skies and on Instagram at Somewhere Skies Pod. Thank you for listening, and remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies. Greetings everyone, Ryan Sprague here, host of Somewhere in the Skies. For over 7 years and more than 400 episodes, the Somewhere in the Skies podcast has always been free to listen to, but it's not free to create. So we offer several ways to help support our efforts and get rewards in return. If you listen to the podcast on Apple, you can click the subscribe button at the top of your Somewhere in the Skies feed to become a premium Apple subscriber. Or you can join our Patreon campaign with several tiers available. Both of these options give you the same benefits and rewards: ad-free episodes, early access to the main show, and bonus episodes and content. Help keep the lights on at the Somewhere in the Skies HQ, and help us continue to grow by becoming a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/somewhereskies, or by clicking the subscribe button at the top of your Apple feed. Thank you for your continued support, and keep looking up. This episode contains content that some might find disturbing. Listener discretion is advised. In his book, Harvest, The True Story of Alien Abduction, Gavin Davies relays the account of a woman known only as Susan. Susan was a lifelong resident of Pembrokeshire in Wales. Davies had first met her in late 2014 after she had replied to a call for anyone who'd experienced a wave of UFOs in the area in 1977. However, after their meeting in a coffee shop in Haverfordwest, Davies realized she had experienced something that stretched far beyond just lights in the sky or even physical craft. This would begin Davies' exploration into the dark encounters of the woman known as Susan.
I live in constant fear that they will return, and that I'll be plucked like a corn in a field that's ready to be harvested.
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
At the initial meeting between Davies and Susan, she admitted that she had not arranged to meet with him to discuss the UFO wave specifically. She did, however, wish to speak with him about what had happened to her much more recently. However, her condition was that they only speak about it from her flat, where they would be the only ones who would be privy to the conversation. Davies agreed, and several days later, he arrived at her flat. Over the following months, Susan would speak extensively with Davies about her encounters. She would state the following to him.
Most people are unaware of something very dominant that treats us like we treat animals. We are a commodity to them. I've witnessed and experienced experimentation and unimaginable pain and terror at the hands of a race who are not human.
But Susan never claimed to be the only one this was happening to.
I've witnessed many other women undergoing the same thing. There will be many others around the world who might suffer from such things as sudden memory loss, strange rashes, and bizarre dreams, who could very well have undergone the same encounters.
Even though it had been several years since she had last been taken by whatever these beings were, she always remained cautious of their return.
I live in constant fear that they will return, and that I'll be plucked like a corn in a field that's ready to be harvested.
Susan would go on to tell Davies that the first encounter she would recall had taken place in November of 2009, while she was staying with friends whose parents owned a farmhouse in the country.
There were 4 of us in total, and after enjoying a few drinks, I opted to sleep in the converted barn that was the guest house. I would take Lenny the boxer dog, whom I was quite taken with. It would be a decision that would lead me to one of the most unnerving nights of my life.
The strangeness, though, began before Susan retired for the evening. She had left her 3 friends in the living room in order to use the bathroom. While she was there, she saw what she thought were car headlights coming up the drive, and also heard Lenny barking downstairs, as he usually did when someone was approaching the house. However, several seconds later, these supposed car headlights were seemingly switched off, and at the same time, the bathroom light also cut out, leaving Susan in complete darkness. Then, all of a sudden, the entire bathroom lit up.
I contemplated whether it might be a helicopter, but if that were the case, I couldn't understand why there was no sound. All I could hear was my friends talking below and Lenny barking. Then, as quickly as it had come on, the light went out. A moment later, the bathroom light came back on.
And that's all Susan remembered happening. The next thing she recalled is going downstairs to greet her friends, and they asked her where she'd been for so long. Susan was confused, as she thought she was only in the bathroom for a few minutes. However, her friends informed her that she'd been gone for almost half an hour. This was odd, but Susan would try to put it in the back of her mind for the time being. Several hours later, the 4 friends decided to turn in for the night. Susan said her goodnights, put Lenny on his leash, and made her way to the converted barn. After smoking a quick cigarette by the door, she returned to the barn and went to bed. Lenny already laying out asleep, Susan lay down as well and drifted off. She awoke suddenly and looked at the clock beside her. It read 3:18 a.m. Then the clock suddenly powered off by itself for no apparent reason.
I had the sudden feeling that someone or something was in the room. I could still hear Lenny barking beside me on the bed. As I squinted into the darkness, I could just make out something moving, about the size of a small child. As I was about to sit up in bed, the entire room lit up.
It was just like the light in the bathroom she'd experienced. The light that had appeared when she had apparently had missing time. Then, Lenny suddenly woke up to the brilliance of the light.
Lenny barked intensely, obviously sensing something was in the room too. At this point, I had a searing pain in my head. Then, at the foot of the bed, that's when I saw a thin, black figure staring back at me. Suddenly, Lenny launched himself at whatever it was.
There was a sudden bright flash, and Lenny let out a howl of pain. The light began to dissipate, and when Susan looked at the foot of the bed, Lenny had completely vanished into thin air. Another bright flash occurred, and mere inches from Susan's face was a black, featureless form. And then Susan blacked out. Susan awoke and sat up in bed. She looked at the clock, which was now working. It read 7:44 a.m.
My entire body ached. My head was the worst. It felt like I was suffering some intense hangover. It was as I was making my way to the bathroom that I suddenly recalled the following evening. I realized that Lenny was nowhere to be seen. It felt as though the recent events were all a dream. I hoped against hope that my friends had let themselves in and had taken Lenny for his morning walk. However, when I arrived at the main house and found Lenny was not there, my heart dropped. I woke my friend and asked if she'd taken Lenny. When she said she hadn't, we immediately went looking for him.
Lenny was never to be found. Although her friends and the parents were forgiving and told her not to blame herself, Susan sensed that they did indeed blame her for losing their beloved pet. She was certain they felt that she hadn't locked the door before going to sleep and Lenny had simply escaped. As it so happened, Susan would rarely see her friends following the encounter. This ordeal, though, was only just the beginning.
I felt intensely ill for several days after the encounter at the barn house, including several nosebleeds and an intense pain right behind my eye. I felt so shaken by the events that I temporarily moved in with my aunt, who lived alone, aside from her cat Mog.
But the events were far from over, and only followed Susan.
One night when I was out with my boyfriend Adrian, we sat in a car park after having picked up some fast food. As we looked over a nearby lake, we could see the lights of the boats making their way through the water. As they were doing so, we saw a bright orange light that appeared to be hovering, increasing in size. I quickly realized that whatever it was headed toward us.
Susan's boyfriend immediately tried to start the car engine, but it repeatedly failed. The object eventually stopped directly in front of them.
I could hear popping in the air as it hovered. Everything around us was bathed in an orange, fiery glow. I could also feel energy pulsating off of it as it hung. Then it shot off into the distance at a great speed and disappeared.
The car started as soon as the object vanished. Susan and Adrian drove away, eventually pulling over in the car park of a nearby pub. Adrian began calling friends, wanting to meet up and return to the spot where they had witnessed the object. Susan, though, already wondering if there was a connection between this anomalous object and her bizarre evening in the barn house, wanted to go home, much to Adrian's annoyance. Instead of taking her home, though, he drove her to a nearby bus stop and left her there alone. That should have been a deal breaker, Susan. The bus arrived a short time later, and she got on. When she sat down on the bus, she noticed droplets of blood dripping onto her pants. That's when she noticed that her nose was bleeding profusely. As soon as she arrived to her aunt's house, she showered, feeling quite ill and exhausted. She soon crawled into bed and tried to fall asleep. That night, she would experience what appeared to be a bizarre, twisted nightmare, but one that Susan realized was intricately connected to the strange events that were unfolding all around her.
I found myself walking in a country lane with a tall man with a featureless face. Then a bright light appeared behind me, and I began to sense fear rising.
The next thing Susan realized, a bright flash blinded her. When she opened her eyes from the flash, her surroundings had somehow changed.
I now found myself on a street in Haverfordwest. There were Christmas decorations everywhere, and it had been snowing. Then I saw a row of pubs ahead and found myself walking towards them. When I went inside, it too was decorated with Christmas decorations, and a Christmas song was playing on the sound system. Then I saw a woman at the bar. When I looked at her face, I was shocked to see that it was my grandmother. I was shocked because she had died years earlier of cancer. She walked over to me and began speaking. Only, it wasn't verbally. It was somehow taking place in my head. Telepathically? My grandmother then began telling me that I had to be brave and help my friends. She then reached forward with her arms towards me. As she did so, the music stopped, and the Christmas lights dimmed and went out. It was at this point that I sensed that there were several figures watching me from the shadows of the room.
Another flash then occurred. Susan felt a sudden pain, as if something was sticking into the back of her head. She felt as though she was suddenly paralyzed, and she could no longer see her grandmother. All she could hear was the sound of her own screams. A moment later, her surroundings changed yet again. Now she found herself sitting in what appeared to be a cinema.
I was now facing a huge screen. I could sense someone sitting beside me, although I was unable to turn around. Then images suddenly appeared on the screen. I recognized them immediately as locations in my hometown. To begin with, it appeared like a promotional video showing all the best parts of Pembrokeshire. Then, things changed dramatically, showing a graphic nature-like scene of a large spider being swarmed and overtaken by ants. I wanted to look away, but I was unable to.
As the film reached its apparent climax, she heard her grandmother's voice before another bright flash appeared, which caused her head to throb with pain. The next thing she knew, she was awake in her bed. She got up to get a drink of water, her throat extremely dry. However, when she opened the door to her room, the tall, faceless figure was standing right in front of her. It reached forward and touched her on the side of the head. The next thing she knew, she was on her bed once more. When she looked at the clock, it was 11 a.m. Susan was sick for most of the day, and despite having slept for over 12 hours, she felt completely drained. Later that evening, realizing she was in desperate need of a good night's sleep, her aunt offered her 2 sleeping pills. As she climbed into bed a short time later, she purposefully left the door of her room open, which allowed her to see into her aunt's room across from her for a sense of security. However, when she fell asleep, she suddenly found herself back in the same dreamlike scenario she had the previous evening. This time, though, instead of finding her grandmother inside the pub, she found a young girl, a girl she immediately recognized.
It was me when I was young.
Like her grandmother the previous evening, her younger self spoke to her telepathically, telling her that she, quote, had done well, and that, quote, her friends had been very grateful for her help. Susan was asked several questions of a nature that suggested that she was being subjected to some kind of evaluation. Although these questions were of a truly bizarre and intrusive nature. When these questions were over, the usual flash appeared before her eyes, and she found herself awake in her bed. This time, however, she couldn't move. She could, though, see across the room into her aunt's room. And more importantly, she could see something in the room.
What I saw, I could only describe as some kind of strange and monstrous jellyfish. This creature was on the bed, over the top of my aunt. It got closer and closer to my aunt's face. A long, tendril-like object moved directly to her nose and went inside it. Then I saw another tendril stretch towards Mog's nose and doing the same thing. The cat began to rise in the air, the tendril still attached, and now inserted into its mouth. In the moment, I truly believed that Moggs was dead. It was at that point that my aunt woke up and saw what was happening around her. She began to scream uncontrollably.
The next thing Susan realized, she was waking up in her bed. She could immediately see that it was now daylight. She immediately looked toward her aunt's room, and her aunt was no longer there. But Susan could hear her. She appeared to be vomiting in the bathroom. Susan went to the bathroom, discovering her aunt on her knees in front of the toilet. She asked if she was okay, to which her aunt responded by simply raising her thumb. When Susan saw inside the toilet bowl, she was horrified. It was completely splattered with blood. She told Susan that she must have caught a bug from work and motioned for her to leave the room so that she didn't catch it too. Susan would eventually help her aunt to bed and left her to rest. She would discover Moggs on one of the chairs a short time later. He was asleep, but even to Susan, he didn't look himself. Susan managed to make an appointment with the doctor for later that day and was prescribed anti-anxiety and sleeping pills. By the time she returned home, her aunt was downstairs. She still looked unwell, but she assured Susan she felt better. Moggs, however, had not eaten at all that day, and she was worried about him. That following evening was largely uneventful, and after several hours, the two women retired to their rooms. Almost inevitably, Susan soon found herself in the same dreamlike state. This time, however, instead of her grandmother or her younger self, the person waiting for her in the pub was her friend, Cian, whose dog, Lenny, had seemingly been taken from the barn house on that fateful night. As before, this figure, Cian, spoke to Susan telepathically, telling her that Lenny was with her friends, and that it was her fault he had gone missing. She was told she had to help these friends and that she had to be brave. Then the music stopped, and the strange figures became visible around her. Suddenly, following the usual flash, Susan found herself once more in the cinema. And again, it showed Pembrokeshire from various locations, even showing people on the streets going about their business. Suddenly, though, everything changed.
Everything became very dark as the skies darkened. The footage now showed a boat on the water, the same stretch of water where Adrian and I had seen the bizarre orange object. The waters became increasingly choppy, and it appeared that fires were everywhere. In fact, the sea itself appeared to be on fire and was rushing down through the water. I could see cars fly past as if they were nothing but toys, and the people of the town were beginning to burn, one of whom was melting like wax. As this fiery water swept over everything in its path, people were incinerated and buildings crumbled to the ground. I watched in horror as an oil tanker on the water tipped on its side and exploded. The explosion was so powerful that it made the camera shake.
As the carnage continued, the screen eventually faded to black.
I thought it was over, but then images appeared again. It showed the aftermath of what I had just witnessed. Remains of people lay everywhere. Every now and again I could see survivors looking around, holding dead loved ones. The scene was one of the most harrowing things I've ever witnessed. I couldn't escape the feeling that what I had witnessed was a vision of the future.
Then, a young girl, her face severely burnt, looked into the camera and directly at Susan. This girl simply and urgently told Susan the following.
Run!
With that, a flash appeared, and Susan woke up in her bed. She quickly went downstairs. When she arrived there, she discovered her aunt standing in the living room, Moggs lying limp in her arms. The cat was indeed dead. Following the 3 consecutive nights of intense activity, things seemed to settle down a little. Susan's aunt, though, despite being told she was simply suffering from the flu, continued to be unwell. Things eventually came to a head when her aunt would ask Susan to move out and back with her parents, which she ultimately did. And the next few months were also uneventful. However, new reoccurring dreams soon began, and they would progress to become more unsettling than ever before. As well as the strange dreams in which she would often find herself walking naked in a field with several other women she didn't know, she would find herself having strange encounters while driving to and from university, including seeing the orange object on several occasions, as if it were following and tracking her movements. And even though she didn't have any encounters like those she experienced while living in her aunt's house, the permanent feeling of anxiety that had temporarily at least left her returned once more. Her aunt, incidentally, would eventually be admitted to a hospital when it was discovered that she had extreme advanced cancer. After this unfortunate diagnosis, she passed away only a week later. It was shortly after her aunt's funeral that Susan found a flat of her own. After what had happened to Lenny, and then her aunt and her cat, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that she would bring danger to her parents' home if she continued to live there. The strange dreams continued. In them, she would see foxes and owls, and couldn't help but wonder if these were symbolic and what they might mean. She was always in the fields, naked, with other women. On one particular evening, after having gone to bed, she awoke in the street, still wearing her pajamas. Then, on the street, she saw a tall figure that she sensed was a woman. It was dressed in a red coat, with a face covered with some kind of hood. Susan turned around and made her way back to the flat. She began to ask herself when she would wake up, and started to contemplate whether she was in fact fully awake. She eventually returned to her flat and made her way to the window. She couldn't see the figure, but she noticed that the street appeared to be awash in a mysterious red glow. She remained at the window for a moment longer before returning to the living room. When she got there, the tall figure in red was standing, seemingly waiting for her. Even more bizarre, around her was some kind of vortex.
This being was clearly feminine, although it was not human. Her head was bigger than the rest of her body, and she had huge dark eyes that were more insect than human. This being stepped toward me and touched one of its claw-like hands to my head. I instantly felt something like electricity shoot into my body. Then, a moment later, everything went silent. It was as if the world had stopped spinning and time froze. The being stepped back into the strange vortex and disappeared.
As unsettling as all these events undoubtedly were, it was the revelations of the last interviews Davies conducted with Susan that was the most unsettling. And not just for Susan, but for humanity as a whole, if, of course, there is any truth to them. This time, the events weren't intertwined with events made to appear like a dream to Susan. They occurred out of the blue as she was driving home after a visit with her parents. It was around 8 p.m. on the night in question. Susan was driving along the road when suddenly a fox, much like in her dream, appeared in front of her. She watched the fox for several seconds before a red glow overtook her surroundings. The next thing she knew, the car headlights faded and everything went black.
The next thing I remembered was walking out of some woodland and into a field. When I looked up, the entire sky was bathed in red. I stumbled forward for several moments before noticing the fox sat at a slight distance from me. As soon as I looked at it, it turned and ran. I couldn't escape the feeling that it was wanting me to follow it into an area of tall grass. I did so, and as I went, I noticed other women there. Eventually, there were dozens of women of various ages, all making their way in the same direction. This didn't seem like a dream at all. It seemed to me like a premonition of sorts.
Things, at least for Susan and the other women she was with, were about to get even more terrifying. Susan suddenly began to notice a trembling sensation in the ground that appeared to be getting stronger. Then, the women began to lift off the ground with a distinct whoosh sound, spiraling and twisting as they did. There was an intense red light and a feeling of excruciating pain before everything once again went black. When Susan awoke, she was standing in a long line of women in what appeared to be a dark, uninviting room. The women were all naked and tightly packed together, their bodies almost touching.
I did my best to look ahead, seeing nothing but a seemingly endless line of women in front of me. Then I noticed a light above the line that was moving closer. I could see that it had what looked like wings on each side of a glowing red orb, and it appeared to be scanning the women below. As it moved over them, it was spraying the women with some unknown misty substance. This spray appeared to have a calming effect.
Because the women were so tight to each other, they were each forced forward by the steps of the person behind them. When some of the women would fall and attempt to climb out of the line, the winged red lights would force them back. Even more disturbing, when one woman fell forward and lost her balance, the red light extended a tube-like device to her, lifted her up by her head, and carried her away. As they moved forward, Susan noticed that the floor was becoming increasingly sludgy and slippery.
I thought that this substance below could have been human remains.
All the while, the women were forced forward, one systematic step at a time.
We were being herded into areas based on our body type, age, and health. As we continued forward, eventually entering a tunnel of sorts, I could hear cries of pain and desperation ahead of me. We eventually came out into a larger room. I noticed on the walls what appeared to be cubes of meat. Before I could contemplate any more, another substance was sprayed onto us, and it appeared as though it was here that the women were being separated into different sections for different purposes.
Susan and the women that were with her had various samples taken from them, which, although invasive, left them uninjured, at least physically. However, what Susan witnessed in another section caused her to question her sanity. She looked on in horror as a conveyor belt of restrained women were moved into place before being, or at least attempting to be, artificially inseminated by what seemed to be a lower half of a man that was seemingly kept alive by a network of electrical wires, like some kind of perverse, unfinished cyborg. Once this grotesque event was over, the women were moved along before being replaced by another set. Even worse, as she and her group moved along this house of horrors, she witnessed a group of pregnant women seemingly giving birth, alone and unaided. Susan also noticed one of the jellyfish-like creatures approach one of the mothers, who had just given birth, and drop onto her before seeming to consume her and the newborn child. As they moved on, Susan witnessed another conveyor belt, only this one appeared to have human body parts on it, which included torsos, limbs, and heads. The most horrific sight, though, was of an area that featured women all screaming who were literally being deconstructed and torn apart.
They were being harvested. There was no other way to describe it. Pipes filled them and they were being pulled apart, with every part of their body being used. There were dozens of women, gone, in an instant.
Susan next remembers waking up in a field. When she looked around her surroundings, she could see the headlights of her car on the road a short distance away. When she made her way to her vehicle, she discovered her clothes in an untidy pile by the car door. When she looked at the clock, it read 8:03 p.m. Although the ordeal had appeared to last hours, and indeed it might have, in the reality as she knew it, only 3 minutes had passed. Davies published Susan's accounts in the previously mentioned book, Harvest. When read in full, it becomes clear the sheer torment and agony that permeated Susan during and following the encounters. The incidents, at least at the time Harvest was released, was the last encounter Susan experienced. However, she would update Davies that she continues to live in fear that the monstrous beings will return any time.
It is my belief that these beings are very old and advanced, and were on a technical level that far exceeds anything that we have a grasp of. They found us in our infancy, and they permitted us to thrive and cover the world. They were harvesting us a little to begin with, and increased this harvesting as the population grew. We seemed to be defenseless.
Following her interviews with Davies, Susan disappeared into anonymity, telling Davies that she had bought a plane ticket to leave from Heathrow Airport to an undisclosed location. The implications to Susan's claims, if they are even slightly accurate, are huge for all concerned. Could it really be that any one of us could be subjected to these horrifying types of encounters? And if so, would we have any defense against it? Furthermore, what should we make of the footage that Susan viewed in the cinema during her ordeal? Could her hometown be subject to some kind of Armageddon-type scenario? And if so, when will this happen? Will this be due to an outright attack or the result of some disaster of some sort? And if it is an attack, what follows after that? Would these beings go from operating out of the shadows to turning the entire planet into a huge cattle-type labor camp? The theories are endless, and indeed Susan's claims are truly disturbing. And we have to entertain the possibility that some, if not a large portion of this, could all be due to many different factors. Vivid nightmares, suppressed memories of traumatic events, or, and this is just a theory and not an accusation, it all could be made up. We've seen the dark and unfortunate unraveling of alien encounters and alien abductions before, when the individual is exposed as either fantasy-prone or simply a liar. However, if this is not the case for Susan, then we are dealing with something far beyond our reach of understanding, and even farther into the darkest corners of the encounter and abduction phenomenon. No matter the case, this cautionary tale of Susan should give us all food for thought, regardless of how outlandish it might sound. And it truly makes one think that while many incidents involving close encounters or even abductions have some sort of reconciliation or closure on those involved, whatever it was Susan experienced provides no closure and no comfort. All it provides, like many UFO cases throughout time, is more questions than answers. Special thanks to voiceover artist Emily Battles for her time and talents in this episode. You can follow her work at emilybattlesactor.com. This episode was co-researched and co-written by Marcus Loth. To learn more, visit ufoinsight.com. Please take a moment to subscribe, follow, rate, and review Somewhere in the Skies on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. It truly helps independent podcasts like ours gain visibility and find new listeners. You can follow us on Twitter at Somewhere Skies and on Instagram at Somewhere Skies Pod. Links to all of our social media, our merch, and additional content can all be found in the link tree of our socials and in the show notes. Thank you for listening, and remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.
Somewhere in the Skies is produced by Third Kind Productions in association with the Entertainment One Podcast Network.
Since 2017, the Somewhere in the Skies podcast has been a place for people in all walks of life to tell their personal UFO stories. How have these sightings and encounters changed those who experience them? From Beyond the Fray Publishing comes Ryan Sprague's brand new book, Stories from Somewhere in the Skies. This compendium brings to life some of the most powerful UFO stories ever submitted to Somewhere in the Skies podcast. It takes us on a fascinating journey through life-altering experiences from those who stared into the skies and had something extraordinary stare back. Stories from Somewhere in the Skies, now available in paperback and ebook on Amazon. Order today from the link in the show notes, or visit Amazon and search for Stories from Somewhere in the Skies.
Hey guys, Ryan hopping in to ask a huge favor. Ratings and reviews are the lifeblood of independent podcasting. We only gain visibility and new listeners by getting featured on different podcast platforms. And we only get featured by more ratings and reviews. You see where this is going. Here's some recent reviews of the podcast over on Apple. Drew and Bro says, 5 stars, the Mount Rushmore of UFO podcasts. The research, writing, and production value on this podcast are top-notch. One of the best UFO podcasts out there. JW83D says, 5 stars. Unlike so many of its peers, the show is rarely campy or hokey, while often maintaining a lighthearted vibe. I really like the intro song and the background music, especially during the documentary-style episodes. I really like the listener stories also. LZD says, 5 stars. Great interviews. The aerial phenomenon episode was interesting on so many levels. It led me to the documentary, and now I can't stop thinking about it. And lastly, from JK, 5 stars. A must for UFO UAP enthusiasts. Somewhere in the Skies never lets me down. I'm a longtime listener and can't wait for the new show each week. I recommend it to anyone interested in this phenomenon. Thank you so much to everyone who has rated and reviewed. And if you haven't, please head over to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get the show. And if it's an option, rate, review, follow, or subscribe. It truly helps more than you know. Thank you so much, and keep looking up. Throughout the history of the Somewhere in the Skies podcast, we've covered hundreds of UFO cases. And within those cases, we've tackled controversial topics, such as UFOs paralyzing witnesses, or the alleged abductions of human beings by aliens. We've even explored the most rare of cases, where during abductions, people decided to fight back. But almost just as rare are those cases where people claimed positive experiences. Some even claimed they were healed of injuries, ailments, and diseases. Today, we'll look at several of those cases and ask the question, were these mysterious miracles done at the hands of human ingenuity, sheer coincidence and happenstance, or by the hands of some sort of god? Or could they possibly have been performed by cosmic occupants said to have come from somewhere in the skies?
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Diphtheria is a serious infection caused by strains of bacteria that make toxins. It can lead to difficulty breathing, heart rhythm problems, and even death. And unfortunately, Alice Haggerty of Trenton, New Jersey, was struck with this disease. Only a young child at the time, and because of her religious background, she had not been vaccinated against this disease. And for the same religious reasons, her parents refused to take her to the hospital. However, they did call in a doctor who said that Alice's condition was in fact very serious. But still, Alice's parents refused to seek conventional treatment. Over the next 2 weeks, Alice's condition deteriorated so much that the doctor began to visit her daily. And by the end of those 2 weeks, he told Alice's mother that he did not expect her to live through the night. But there was something about Alice that the doctor didn't know, and something she had never told anyone else. She was an alleged UFO contactee. And on this particular night that she was presumed to not survive, she would state the following about what happened.
I was taken on board by friendly ETs, which, at the time, I believed were angels in white robes with silver belts. I remember being transported into a small rounded room where the ETs told me I would be cured. They waved a small rod-like device around my body and then had me stand inside a large blue cylinder with a little window. The ETs watched me as a bright light was emitted from the top of this machine until it was about 8 inches from the top of my head. The light then retracted, and then I was instructed to exit the cylinder. The ETs informed me in a matter-of-fact manner that I was now cured and cleansed.
The next morning, Alice's mother found her playing on the floor as if everything was normal. Alice was ordered into bed by her mother and her doctor, but both quickly realized that her condition was completely gone. Later in life, having experienced many other contacts with these alleged ETs, Alice believed that this first experience was in fact a genuine contact with extraterrestrials, and that they had cured her of this often fatal disease. The next case takes place in Gainesville, Florida, with a man named Jim Law. Law, appropriately an attorney by trade, would state the following about what happened to him.
Sometime in the later part of the year 2000, I began having a strange dull pain in my left groin area. I passed it off as having possibly strained myself working out at the gym, and I hoped that whatever I had done would just go away. For several months after, I dealt with it. Sometimes it didn't bother me, but it got really aggravated whenever I worked out. I began to suspect I had a hernia, and I made an appointment for a full physical. In November of that year, Dr. Fine at Gainesville, Florida performed a full physical and determined that I had a hernia and recommended that I see a urologist for further consultation. I made the appointment with a person by the name of Dr. Senden. Dr. Senden performed an examination and determined that I had an inguinal hernia on the left side. He recommended surgery as soon as possible. The surgery date was set for February 23rd, 2001 at the Surgical Group of Gainesville. I was to arrive at 10:30 a.m. for pre-op before the 12:30 p.m. surgery. It was to be a mesh repair for the hernia in my left groin.
About a week or so before the surgery, Jim awoke in the middle of the night with a strange feeling that something or someone other than his girlfriend was in the room. This was a feeling Jim had many times before, having claimed a history of encounters with UFOs and their alleged occupants. In fact, in 1963, when he was about 5 years old, he saw a UFO hovering over Lake Minnetonka in Minnesota. That was his first clue that there was something strange happening. He'd have more encounters in his 30s, and he began having really weird experiences, such as his burglar alarm being triggered in the middle of the night, or things being moved in his home with no signs of a break-in or memory of moving anything. He developed an unexplained fear of intruders after all of this. But it wasn't until this incident in 2001, when he sensed a presence in his room, that he really began to connect the dots.
I saw 3 figures, gray-colored, with big almond eyes. They entered the room, apparently through the wall. At first I was startled, but I got a grip on my feelings, slowed my heart rate, and I told them, "If you wish to continue visiting me, then you need to do something for me, or I will make you go away." I think they understood what I meant. One of them said to me, "We know of your condition you have. We will help you." One of these figures then pointed a shiny object about a foot long at the area of my hernia. I don't remember feeling anything. I do remember asking them why they visited me like this, and one of them said that they were interested in me because I had the genetic potential to live a long time. I must state for fact that my grandfather is a very healthy 105-year-old born in 1898. He has lived in 3 centuries and works out in the yard every day. He walks on a cane and looks better than most 80-year-olds. Also, his mother and her sister lived 109 years old, so I can see why they would be interested.
And with that, Jim soon realized that his hernia had completely gone away. When he was re-examined by his doctors, they were completely mystified as to how this could have happened. But after several more checkups and a second opinion, Jim was completely in the clear. Whether a medical anomaly or not, one thing was certain, at least for Jim.
To this day, I do not have a hernia. I truly believe this is a very well-verified case of healing through contact with what I believe was extraterrestrial intervention.
The following case comes from a former Air Force officer by the name of Michael Thomas Knox and took place in Irvine, California at the Hotel Irvine during a UFO conference. This occurred September 24th to September 27th, 2015. Michael was an active MUFON field investigator and was attending the conference. On the first night, he retired to his hotel room. At this time, he had recently torn his Achilles tendon in his left leg. Doctors told him that it was in fact completely separated and that he needed surgery. It wouldn't heal on its own. But the next morning, Knox woke up to quite a surprise. His leg was no longer in any pain, and he felt completely healed. Stranger, however, was a distinct triangular mark he found on his leg. When he told several other of the conference attendees about waking up with a healed leg, his roommate for the conference, a woman we'll call Melissa, had quite a story to tell about what had happened that night to Knox.
I came into the room around 11 p.m. and Michael Knox was already asleep. I fell asleep quickly around midnight. Now, at some point, I was woken up and I felt like I was floating out of the hotel room. I remember standing outside of the hotel room on the rooftop, looking back into the window at Michael lying in his bed inside the room. With him, I could see 3 gray aliens standing by his bed, holding his leg and giving him some sort of injection. I was pounding on the window, yelling for him to wake up. He began fighting them, kicking and yelling, and then soon, we were both taken up along with several other people that I recognized from the conference. We were taken up inside a cigar-shaped craft. All of us were then placed in chairs which resembled beauty salon chairs with hair dryers above them. We were all restrained in the chairs, and the parts that looked like a hair dryer, well, then they were placed over each one of our heads. I had the impression that these grays were allowing the people in the chairs to transfer mental information between each other.
Melissa counted at least 20 grays on board this craft, and after the apparent information transfer, some of the people were physically examined. After which, everyone was returned to their respective hotel rooms. Later that morning, Melissa would tell Michael of what had happened, but Michael remembered nothing other than sleeping throughout the night. But something had clearly happened which healed his leg. Together, Melissa and Michael got a blacklight and used it to examine their hotel room. What they found would leave Michael speechless. On his leg, he found strange phosphorescent particles. These particles were also found on Melissa's pajamas, her bed, and various other spots throughout the room. But the most bizarre thing was when they found what appeared like 3 strange fingerprints on Michael's leg. After describing these experiences to other members at the conference, several would tell Melissa and Michael that they had seen a large UFO over the hotel that very same night. Whether all of this was some sort of shared hysteria of believers enabling one another at a UFO conference, or maybe just simple misinterpretations of different events happening at similar times, one thing was for certain. Michael Knox had somehow completely been cured of his torn Achilles tendon injury. It just so happened to be at a UFO conference. The following case concerns an anonymous young boy in Peru who had injured himself very badly during a fall. He unfortunately also lapsed into a coma. The main witness to this healing and case was an engineer by the name of Victor Kapitanovic. On March 10, 1960, in the region of Callejon de Huelas, Victor came across a family in the small remote village as he was passing through. One of the parents told Victor that their son had fallen from a cliff and was apparently dying of his injuries. Victor, for reasons he couldn't readily explain, asked if he could see the young boy. The parents agreed and brought him to the boy, who was lying on the floor in a hut, not moving at all. Victor would state the following about the experience with the boy.
His swollen face had taken a bluish color by the infections. His eyes were half closed, his mouth half open, with his tongue and lips swollen. He looked terrible. I bent down to examine the boy and could barely detect a pulse. I noticed that the boy was, in fact, in a comatose state, and the closest hospital was many, many miles away. I offered to transport the child. His mother angrily refused and explained that the gods from the sky would take care of my son. I was confused, and I asked my guide what she meant by this. He would go on to explain to me that the locals were often in contact with UFO beings whom they called sky gods.
Victor was intrigued because he himself had seen several strange objects while traveling through the region. Discs, to be exact.
I decided to stay and see if this was true. Would these sky gods actually show up to heal this boy?
Soon, the skies filled with clouds. And suddenly, the boy's parents began shouting and pointing to the clouds. And that's when Victor saw it.
It was a disc-shaped apparatus, similar to a small airplane. It dropped out of the clouds and landed silently among the herd of sheep and goats below. A door opened and a figure emerged. It was a woman. She looked entirely human, though her skin was quite pale and she was very short. She was dressed in a full bodysuit, unlike anything I'd seen before. She floated towards us in the hut, a few inches off the ground. At this point, my guide and the family dropped to their knees and began to pray. The woman motioned for them to rise. She then scooped up the young boy and carried him into the landed craft. Then the door to the craft closed.
After several minutes, the door opened, and what Victor saw next completely shocked him.
It was the boy. He descended alone from a ladder of the craft, and when he made it to the ground, he ran towards us, showing no signs of injury. I was in such disbelief that I thought maybe it was a different boy. Maybe they had taken another boy in the craft, and he was now coming out, but I watched as his mother ran toward him, shouting in emotion, and embraced him. I looked the boy over, and there was no sign of any previous injuries. It was a miracle.
At this point, the woman from the craft exited and approached the group. Victor began to speak to her, asking who she was. She would tell him that her name was Ivanka. She invited him on board the craft. He curiously obliged and was given a tour. There, he would meet several other members of this strange race of human-like people. They conversed with him for over an hour.
They explained to me that they were here to heal the Earth, but that they couldn't keep up with the pain and destruction that humans were causing one another, and the destruction we were causing to the planet itself. It was a very somber moment. They guided me out of the craft, said goodbye, and they left.
Victor would claim that he had frequent contact with these beings after this event. He would help spread their messages of future destruction of Earth, and would do everything he could to try to help heal the world, like they had done that day with a young boy in Peru. This next case took place just outside of Paris, France, and involved a radio engineer by the name of Gilbert Camille. Gilbert was suffering from liver disease, which was becoming progressively worse. As an engineer, he spent his time between two different shops that he owned. While traveling between shops one morning, he'd experienced something that really frightened him. On March 5th, 1971, at approximately 1 a.m., he was driving down the road when he noticed a strange light ahead of him. He first thought it might be the lights of the town he was heading towards, but as he continued driving, he realized the lights were actually coming from the woods in the distance. The closer he got to the lights, he noticed that there were actually 8 different lights located in front of the woods by a large meadow on the side of the road. The lights were laid out regularly at ground level, parallel with the edge of the forest. They were rectangular in shape and a soft bluish color, and they seemed to be connected to something. Gilbert would describe the following.
I could barely make it out except that I could see the moonlight reflecting off the surface. It was a craft of some sort. It was gray and metallic. It had small windows as well. It was like a half sphere, flattened. I'd say it was about 30 feet in height and maybe about 50 feet wide.
But as startling as the craft was, Gilbert would be just as startled moments later when he saw something else.
I saw 3 creatures. They were heading towards me from a small slope between the woods and the road. They were on all fours, crawling on their arms and legs. They were quite large. They had tan-colored skin with huge insect-like heads, almost like a mantis. As they approached, they all stopped at once, staring straight at me. As the moon got brighter, I could see that it wasn't just 3 of these creatures. There were at least 20 in total. Some of them were standing upright, while others were on all fours, as if they were looking for something on the ground. I could hear nothing other than my car. As I continued driving slowly, I noticed a pale blue beam of light which shone on the back of my car. The light then began to illuminate the entire woods around me.
As Gilbert looked out his rearview mirror, he could see that the light was now being projected right at his car. He could see that the creatures were all around him, behind him, to both sides and in front. He was absolutely petrified at this point. And then the beam of light hit him.
The fear of the moment completely left me, and it also felt like everything was taken control of. I could not steer the vehicle. I could not speed up or slow down, nothing. The hood had become fluorescent as well. At this moment, the car was completely out of my control, and I became very disoriented.
Gilbert doesn't remember much after this. He does remember reaching his home and going inside. When he prepared to go to sleep that night, he removed his clothes to take a shower and noticed something strange on the left side of his shirt. There was about 7 or 8 marks in the shape of a rectangle. These were about 5 centimeters in size. They seemed almost gold in color and a little bit phosphorescent. The marks faded within minutes, and with that, Gilbert went to sleep. The next morning, Gilbert decided he would go back to the area with his son to see if he could find any trace of what had happened. At first, he found nothing, but the closer he looked in the area where the beings had been seen, he immediately saw that the grass had been crushed down in a sort of half-spherical shape, about 30 feet in length. Gilbert, remembering that it was so cold that night that it actually snowed, now noticed that the area where this spherical shape was devoid of any snow. His son touched the area and said it was actually very warm to the touch. It was at this point that Gilbert saw something else that was rather strange.
There are strange footprints all around the area. They looked like that of shoes, except there were no heels in the prints, and they were very large.
But this wasn't it. Gilbert noticed something else, which was very odd.
This area was known for large patches of dandelions that would grow on the roadside. And even though there was light snow, I could tell from seeing the surrounding area that where the sphere was in the ground, there was no flowers at all, as if they had all been picked.
But it wasn't so much the dandelions missing that caught Gilbert's interest.
I had remembered from speaking to many gardeners throughout the years that dandelions have many medicinal qualities, such as antioxidants and anti-inflammatory qualities. And when I found the strange marks on my shirt, it reminded me of when you'd sometimes fall into patches of flowers, and they would leave smudges or remnants on your skin or the clothes. It looked very similar to the color of dandelions. The other odd thing was that I had a coat on during the event, but these markings had somehow only ended up on my shirt underneath.
Prior to the event, Gilbert was having very painful headaches constantly. He also had little to no appetite. Due to his liver disease, his health was so bad that he'd reached the point of deep depression and just did not want to go on anymore. But something happened after the incident that night.
Directly after this event, my headaches had ceased and my appetite had returned, and as the days went on, I just felt better and better. But most importantly, after a few meetings with my doctors, they had informed me that my liver disease had completely disappeared. They, as well as I, were completely dumbfounded.
So was this encounter with these four-legged creatures somehow responsible for Gilbert's sudden health returning to normal? Were the medicinal dandelions used in some way to help heal him? While it may be a stretch, Gilbert believes so.
Whatever happened that night on that road was the reason I am alive today. I have no doubt of that. I don't know what they were, where they came from, or what they did to me. But I am truly grateful, and I would not trade it for anything.
The Travis Walton UFO incident made international headlines when, on November 5th, 1975, Walton, along with 6 co-workers, were on their way home after a long day of felling and piling trees in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. Just after sunset, as they drove along the bumpy forest road, they noticed an unusual light emanating through the tree line ahead. As they got closer to the light source, they discovered that it was coming from a 20-foot-long metallic craft, which hung motionless about 20 feet above the forest floor. The 23-year-old Travis Walton's curiosity got the better of him, and he jumped out of the stationary truck and stood directly beneath the incredible machine to get a better look. Suddenly, the object began to wobble and vibrate before shooting out a beam of intense light, which hit Travis, knocking him clean off his feet and tossing him through the air like a rag doll. His friends departed in a blind panic before returning shortly after to find him gone. Travis was missing for 5 days, and the others were accused of his murder. Fortunately, he arrived home in time to save them from further scrutiny. What Travis Walton experienced on board that craft is well documented in his book, The Travis Walton Experience, which led to a blockbuster Hollywood movie, Fire in the Sky, released in 1993. Walton claimed to have witnessed 3 gray aliens on board the ship, and later, during the event, he met human-looking beings who he described as being smooth-skinned and blemishless. What was truly never discussed, however, was the motivations of these aliens when Travis was on board their supposed craft. The same craft that had hit him with a beam of light and left him for dead. Literally. Walton now believes that this beam of light ended his life. But clearly, this wasn't the end of the experience, and certainly not the end of Travis Walton. In an interview with Open Minds TV, Walton expressed the following about that night.
I'm thinking now that the reason I was taken aboard was because there was no choice. I would have been dead. I used to sort of accept the terminology abduction, but now I'm calling it more of an ambulance call. I really think it was an accident. I don't think they were firing at me or, trying to, stun me or punish me or anything like that. I think it was some kind of an effect of the propulsion. They were powering up to leave and just get away from us. And I raised up and got too close, and I think some kind of energy just found its way to ground. In hindsight, I'm thinking that a lot of the terror and a lot of the fear that I was reacting with and the pain I was experiencing had nothing to do with anything that was being inflicted on me, and it was just sort of an accident of circumstance.
Circumstance seems to be a key word when it comes to each of these stories. Were these individuals who were suffering in their own ways cured and healed by some sort of alien intervention? Did the lens in which they viewed their experience dramatically influence their perception of something more medically or scientifically based? There's no one answer, and each struggled with not only how they were healed, but why. Like many who survive traumatic events, medical emergencies, or life-threatening ordeals, there's often a challenging emotional journey of how one decides to live their life after the event. And for Alice, Jim, Michael, the young boy of Peru, Gilbert, and Travis Walton, that journey and those answers will be completely different, profound, and arguably may lay somewhere in the skies. The stories of alien and UFO healings doesn't end here. Over on Patreon, we explore the fascinating and mysterious case of the healing of Dr. X. Head on over to Patreon right now to hear this bonus episode and many others. To listen and to learn more, visit patreon.com/somewhereskies. This episode was co-researched by Preston Dennett. To learn more, visit his website or follow him on Twitter at Preston E. Dennett. Links are in the show notes. Special thanks to our voiceover talents in this episode: Lenita Elder, Brent Hand, Karina Yobel, Alex Perrone, and Christopher Susi. To learn more about them, visit the links in our show notes as well. Hey guys, Ryan here. The Somewhere in the Skies podcast is a labor of love every week, and with that comes many different costs to keep the show running. That's where our Patreon campaign comes in. You give what you think the show is worth. There's different rewards available all the time, including shoutouts on the show, early editions of main episodes, bonus episodes and content, and very soon, monthly patron hangouts, where we sit back and chat all things UFOs. So I hope you'll consider becoming a Patreon subscriber today. To learn more and to join, visit patreon.com/somewhereskies. Thank you for your support and keep looking up. As a general rule, when someone is visited by a gray They find themselves paralyzed, unable to move any part of their body, except perhaps their eyes. "Don't worry," they often say telepathically. "We won't hurt you." For every rule, however, there are exceptions. In some rare outlying cases, witnesses are able to break free from their paralysis. And in a few of these cases, witnesses react by attacking their kidnappers, punching them in the face, choking them around the neck, or getting into some sort of physical altercation. And it happens more often than you might think. Alien abductions are most often a very intrusive and terrifying experience for the person being abducted. But, according to some accounts, there are those rare instances when an abductee fought back, and it was just as terrifying for the alien Grey itself. These are their stories.
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Perhaps one of the most famous examples of punching a gray alien comes from Travis Walton, a woodcutter from Arizona. You may know his story from the film Fire in the Sky. On November 3rd, 1975, Travis and 6 other men encountered a UFO hovering at treetop levels in the Sitgreaves National Forest. While the others stayed in their pickup truck, Travis got out and ran under the object. He was struck by a beam and subsequently taken on board the craft. Missing for 5 days, Travis Walton finally returned with an incredible story. His experience of meeting greys and human-like ETs is very well known in UFO lore. And one of the most unusual aspects of his case is that he claims to have physically fought with the ETs. After being struck by the beam of light, Travis woke up and initially thought he was in a hospital. Now, the movie, Fire in the Sky, was not exactly accurate when it came to what happened next. Only after seeing that he was lying on a table surrounded by greys did Walton react. Here he is explaining what happened in those harrowing moments.
In the movie, there's a little bit of striking on the part of the aliens against me. That didn't happen. I lashed out at them. The one closest to me, I felt really weak. I didn't have enough strength to do much. So when my arm contacted him, he just fell back very unexpectedly easy into the other one. And I rolled off the table in the other direction. And they came around the table, and the 3 of them were coming towards me. And I just grabbed something from behind me, an object off of the shelf there, and started swinging it at them. It was just some large, long cylinder or rod, glass, some clear material. I wasn't studying it. I was looking at them and swinging wildly, screaming threats. They stopped, and I was planning on attacking more fully, just making way past them. The only doorway I could see was on the other side of them.
The rest of the Travis Walton experience is quite incredible and complex. To hear the entire story in Travis's own words, I'd highly recommend checking out the documentary, Travis, The True Story of Travis Walton. There'll be a link in the show notes. So back to punching aliens. Could it be that the Greys are physically weak and fragile? Consider this next case from the files of the Mutual UFO Network. Around 4 a.m. on April 5th, 2017, a young man from Del Valle, Texas, was woken by the sound of his family's dogs barking. Overcome with some weird feeling, he searched the house, checking the room where his mom and her boyfriend slept. He was shocked to see 2 grays, each about 6 feet tall, standing by the beds. At the same time, another gray came floating in through the window. The witness stated the following to MUFON investigators.
My first reaction was to grab the nearest one. I flipped him and punched him in the head. The other figure grabbed me. I turned and swung and punched him in the head. As soon as I looked back at the third figure, it was floating back out the window. Both my mom and her friends started to float up, and I blacked out. I woke up back in bed sweating, panting heavily, and my fists were red in pain. The dogs were barking real violently outside.
Another case of a person punching a gray comes from MUFON field investigator Ben Moss. The witness is Sarah, which is a pseudonym, a young woman from Virginia. One evening in 2010, Sarah was driving home from work when a triangular-shaped object dropped from the sky and hovered about 25 feet over her car. The object was about 20 feet long, totally silent, with white lights on the corners and a single red light in the center. It paced her car for about half a minute, then took off straight up into the air. Sarah had never seen a UFO before, but both her father and her grandmother had. It looked as though they were following her family, including herself. Evidence about this would come out some 6 years later. On October 17th, 2016, Sarah was alone in bed. It was around 4 a.m., and her husband had just left for work. Sarah was suddenly awoken by a strange shuffling of footsteps coming from the back of her house. She wondered if it was an intruder, but at the same time had an awful feeling that it might be the Greys. Slowly, the footsteps came closer. Terrified, Sarah lay motionless in bed. Suddenly, the intruder was in the room. She felt 3 small figures grab her and try to pull her from her bed. Sarah immediately began to fight.
It was very hard for me to get my right arm free, but I did, and I started fighting and punching them as much and as hard as I could. I made contact with the bottom of my fist on one of them a few times, and I remember that it almost felt like I was hitting a rubbery tire-like material, but it wasn't as dense of a material as a tire is. It was like a mix of flesh and rubber. They suddenly let me go, and I got my feet under me.
Sarah got back into bed, terrified and angry. A few seconds passed when she suddenly blacked out.
The next thing that I remember is my alarm going off in the morning to wake me up for work. I noticed that I had a lot of pain and soreness all over my body, almost like severe aching muscles and joints from a bad flu. I felt like I had a lot of bloating and inflammation in my body as well, and had a bad headache. It took approximately 2 weeks to recover from the physical effects. When I saw things that had been knocked on the floor by the bed during the fight with them earlier, I just began crying, because it was a reminder that what had happened was real.
While Sarah was able to punch the aliens, she wasn't able to prevent herself from being taken. Only a few months after the encounter, she went under hypnosis and recalled a full-blown abduction by the Greys. Perhaps a classic case of a human-alien fistfight comes from researchers Don Worley and Ann Druffel. The main witness, Patsy Wingate of Knoxville, Tennessee, has had many encounters with Greys throughout her life. One winter evening in 1985, Patsy woke up in the middle of the night to see 3 Greys enter her bedroom through the wall. Patsy, who was pregnant, mentally shouted to the Greys, "Leave me alone." When the Greys continued to advance, she became enraged. Ann Druffel, who interviewed Patsy, stated the following about what she was told by Patsy.
She jumped out of bed and ran toward them, attacking the one in the center, who was slightly taller than the other two. Without thinking, she seized its neck and squeezed firmly. To her astonishment, the thin neck snapped and the entity's oversized head fell onto its back. She heard the sound of its neck snapping.
Patsy was horrified. She had only meant to stop the ET, not kill it.
Its neck just broke like a twig, and its head fell straight backward. Now, the other two got this look on their faces like, huh? You could see their eyes lift slightly in surprise. It was like, how did she do that? Like, how come we couldn't stop her?
The two other Greys scooped up their fallen companion and exited the same way they had arrived, through the wall. Another example comes from a witness who went by the name of Tim, a sports instructor from Louisiana. As a boy, Tim had a series of close-up UFO sightings and missing time. He began having dreams at night that he was on board a craft, though he wasn't sure if these were just dreams or actual encounters. The encounters continued into his teenage years. It was during one of these teenage encounters that Tim had a physical altercation with one of the Greys. Around age 20, he had another alien dream. Only on this occasion, he had proof that it wasn't a dream at all. It was real. This was his one truly fearful experience.
I had what I thought was a dream, where the aliens had taken me up into the spaceship, and they had restrained me on a table, and they left the room. I got loose somehow. They hadn't fully restrained me, and I got loose. And I got up, and I started walking around. And when they noticed I was walking around, well, one of them came at me, and I punched him in the head. His head was soft, like a beanbag almost. When I punched him in the head, he went down. I think it killed him. Suddenly, I was fighting several of them. I was fighting them and beating them, physically hitting them. I remember one of them jumping toward me, and he had like 3 or 4 fingers on each hand. I remember him jumping toward me, and then I remember seeing like 7 or 8 other ones right behind him, all coming for me at the same time. And I remember seeing his eyes, his big black eyes, right in front of my face. And I remember going backwards, and that's the last thing I remember.
When he woke up, Tim instantly recalled the dream. Then, looking down at his arm, he saw that he was hurt.
I had a cut on my arm, like a scratch or a scrape. It took a long time to heal, but it finally did heal up.
He wanted to believe that he had hurt himself while sleeping, but he knew it couldn't be true. He couldn't have cut himself that badly. It was one of what would become many encounters for Tim, but this was most definitely the only time he ever punched a Grey in the face. Another case comes from Gary, again a pseudonym. Gary resides in England. When he was a young boy, he and his parents took a vacation from their home in Cumbria. On their return trip, they were followed home by a UFO. They soon began having more UFO sightings. Meanwhile, Gary reported seeing short, dark figures come into his bedroom at night. This would begin a lifelong series of encounters with the Greys. Numerous times throughout his life, Gary found himself paralyzed and floating from his bed and out the window. He had many conscious memories of being on board a UFO. In most of these memories, he was paralyzed or is strangely obedient. Sometimes, however, Gary has fought back. On several occasions, Gary woke up to find the Greys in his bedroom or walking around inside the house. While most of his abductions occurred in the middle of the night, Gary recalls one incident from 2016 that occurred in the morning. He walked downstairs, and to his shock, there was a Grey standing in the living room next to the base of the stairs. He instantly remembered an earlier incident when he had come upon a Grey in the living room standing like a scolded schoolboy. On that occasion, Gary had passed out before he had a chance to react. This time, events unfolded just a little bit differently. Gary lunged forward, wrapped his hands around the Grey's neck, and began to choke it.
This time it wasn't as quick, but I grabbed it by the throat. In a single moment, 1,000 thoughts went through my head. I remember thinking, how surreal. I've got some creature from another world by the throat. What the hell do I do now? Its skin felt cold, firm and leathery. It was a split second because then its spindly little arms were spinning around like windmills, desperately trying to get rid of me. It was screaming in my head, get off me now.
Without warning, something rushed at Gary from behind. He instantly lost consciousness.
That's all I remember. I have no idea what happened after that, where I went, or for how long. I have no idea. But looking back, it's nice to make those bastards panic for a change.
More encounters followed this one. Then, during late December of 2018, Gary was lying in bed when he suddenly began to sense the Greys coming.
Sometimes there's an energy that precedes them, just before they enter the room. I don't know if it's to make it easier for them to move or to subdue me. It's kind of a heaviness. It's hard to explain.
The heaviness was strong. If it was meant to paralyze him, it wasn't working. But it did let him know that the Greys were actually in the room. This time, Gary was ready for them.
I waited until it had pulled the covers right back and I punched it in the face. And I can tell you now, they may look small and cute to some people sometimes, but this thing suddenly changed. It was furious. It hissed loudly and lunged for me. Its face changed. Suddenly it looked nothing like a grey. It looked like something completely different. Its small, narrow mouth went from a tiny slit to a wide, gaping thing with spiky teeth. It was something that, in all intent and purposes, seems to try to come across as innocent, frail, and harmless, but in fact has the teeth of a predator for gripping, shredding, and ripping. And when I punched it, it was like its mask slipped for a moment, revealing its true identity. I shot up in bed. I thought I was going to die. I threw my fist right back. I was going to punch it through the wall. I thought I was fighting for my life.
The experience abruptly ended. Upon waking up, Gary remembered the confrontation, the leathery feel of the Grey's skin, the way it had opened its mouth to reveal small, pointed teeth. He was about to punch it again when he passed out. Gary was amazed at how he had been able to fight back against the Greys. They were no longer able to paralyze him with their energy. Next time, he vowed to fight back again. Only a few months later, he was lying in bed when he felt their energy fill the room. They were here again. He thought to himself, this time, he wouldn't punch them. He would kick them with more power.
As soon as I thought that, I was out cold. I think now I'm in their bad books.
Gary's encounters, unfortunately, continue, even up until today. Another case of humans fighting Greys comes from Ramon, a now retired United States Marine officer from Palmdale, California. Starting at age 6, Ramon experienced a series of abductions by the Greys. More abductions occurred throughout his teenage years, and when he was in his mid-30s in December of 1982, Ramon had his most extensive abduction, during which he was physically examined, saw hybrid aliens, and so much more. It was during this incident that he got into a physical fight with one of the Greys. They were now trying to take him away to be physically examined. Ramon was unable to resist, and he sat down.
Out of the air, a tabletop floats right to me over my knees and just stays there. On the table was a petri dish-type container. At that moment, a taller Grey walked in. It comes over and tries to put a cup over my genitals. They started to take off my shirt and unbuckle my pants.
At this point, Ramon broke free from the semi-paralysis and tried to fight them. The Grey tells Ramon to calm down and that everything will be okay. It then pushed Ramon back into the chair. Ramon felt a surge of anger, and summoning his Marine combat training, he lifted his arms and pushed the Grey forcefully down onto the floor. The Grey quickly stood back up. Suddenly, Ramon found himself by a half-dozen more Greys. The main Grey tells them to hold Ramon down.
They started to push me down into the chair, and I was fighting back. The main Grey tried to place a mask-like device over my face, presumably to sedate me so they could finish whatever it is they wanted to do to me. I see the main Grey's fingers. They were twice as long as mine and appeared claw-like. That's when I blacked out.
Although Ramon didn't know what happened after that, he was happy that if this happened again, he could resist even stronger. These types of accounts of punching aliens are rare, but they do show us that it is possible to physically resist the Greys. In fact, researcher Ann Druffel maintains that there are several methods people can use to defend themselves against alien abduction.
Physical resistance is paramount. The ability of an ordinary-sized human to attack and disable a UFO entity. It shows that physical struggle is sometimes possible even in the worst of abduction scenarios, and indicates the so-called Greys are not physically superior to humans.
These cases show us that Greys are not invulnerable. They may be mentally powerful and technologically advanced, but physically, they seem to be pretty damn weak. These cases also conform with the Greys' intense interest in examining humans and obtaining genetical material. Many abductees have been told that the reason for this is to revitalize their race. Apparently, the Greys know that they are physically weak. This would also explain why they almost always render people paralyzed before they approach. Could they actually be somewhat afraid of our defense mechanisms and physical superiority? If humans are truly physically stronger than Greys, this information could prove to be very useful during an abduction scenario. That alone makes cases like these, although entertaining, also useful if you find yourself face to face with a Grey, and you have to decide if you're going to become a part of their experiments, or are they going to become your personal punching bag. Nobody truly knows, but the fight goes on somewhere in the skies. This episode was researched and co-written by Preston Dennett. You can learn more about his work at the link in our show notes. Special thanks to our voiceover contributors, Bruce Priddy, Rebecca Young, Darcy Staniforth, Christopher Susi, Vinnie Adams, and Scott Sikora. Links to all of their work can also be found in the show notes. As an independent podcaster, ratings and reviews make a huge difference in helping us gain visibility and find new listeners. Please take a few moments to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Podchaser, or wherever you get the show. Thank you in advance. We're on Twitter at Summer Skies and Instagram at Summer Skies Pod. Links to our official store and YouTube channel are in the show notes. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.
Somewhere in the Skies is produced by Third Kind Productions in association with the Entertainment One podcast network.
One evening in the fall of 1976, husband and wife, Dan and Joyce Ahrens, were heading to bed after settling their children, 3-year-old Daniel and 1-year-old Heather. Heather slept in a crib on the far side of Dan and Joyce's bedroom. The parents soon put on their pajamas, kissed each other goodnight, and went to sleep. But at some point in the night, a red light suddenly lit up the entire bedroom in a strange glow. What happened next was beyond terrifying, and even more so, it was beyond explanation.
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
Joyce and Dan Ahrens had just awoken in bed to a strange red glow enveloping their entire bedroom. Dan believed a fire had started outside. He turned to alert Joyce of this suspicion. However, despite how hard he tried, no words or even sounds would leave his mouth. It was at this point that they both realized they suddenly couldn't move. Needless to say, each was beyond perplexed by the events that were unfolding around them. Both also knew that they had been fully awake when the light appeared moments earlier, so they were not imagining this unsettling episode. Joyce, many years later, would recall the following about that night.
I couldn't feel my body. I couldn't move, except for my eyes. I was just frozen there. My eyes shooting back and forth, trying to see what was causing this. I screamed and screamed, but it was in my head. Nothing was coming out.
Although this episode only appeared to last several seconds, it felt like a small eternity for the pair. Then, as suddenly as it arrived, the light went out, returning the room to darkness. As soon as it did so, each regained full control of their bodies and speech. It was at that moment that Joyce's attention veered toward the crib where Heather had been sleeping.
She was awake, standing in the crib, her eyes wide, staring at us.
Both Dan and Joyce were completely at a loss with what had just transpired. But even more bizarre, rather than discuss the events, the pair simply settled their daughter and returned to sleep. They wouldn't speak of the event for many years to come. Years later, Heather recalled something that she would relay to her parents. These were recurring nightmares where a gigantic monster terrorized her, and there was some sort of strange eye that she looked into and could see her own reflection. When she was 11 years old, she would draw a picture of this monster.
She was 11 at the time. She had a vivid nightmare one night and woke up screaming. After settling her down, I asked her to draw what she believed she had seen. She quickly did so. The head was very big. It had large, black, almond-shaped eyes and 2 small nostrils. Its mouth was nothing more than a small slit.
In essence, what Heather was describing and then drawing was what many would consider an alien gray.
Dan and I didn't really understand what it was or what she was talking about. Frankly, we didn't believe her, thinking it was her imagination sparked by nothing more than nightmares.
But their thoughts changed when someone else in the family would also show signs that something strange had occurred. It was their son, Daniel.
There were many times when my husband and I would wake up in the morning and basically have to hunt around the house to locate Daniel. We'd usually discover him in another room as opposed to being in his bedroom, or he'd be in a closet or under a chair or table. It was very strange. We'd always ask him what he was doing, and he would tell us that he was hiding from something. What that something was, he was never quite sure.
It was a decade and a half later when Dan, the husband, had something truly strange happen to him.
I received a call from Dan while he was at work. He asked me to come and get him and drive him to the hospital. When I arrived and got him, his heart was pounding and he couldn't breathe. He thought he was having a heart attack.
Dan was admitted to the hospital and doctors quickly established that he wasn't having a heart attack. However, they were at a loss as to what the problem might be. Several doctors examined Dan and his symptoms. One believed, for reasons unknown, that he was having a series of panic attacks, perhaps caused by severe stress. Another doctor suggested that Dan might have an inner ear infection. Ultimately, though, his condition remained undiagnosed. And from that point on, Dan became a recluse of sorts. Joyce would recall the following.
He couldn't do anything. Couldn't work. Couldn't leave the house. It was almost as though he was depressed for some unknown reason. He would tell me, "There's something in the back of my mind that's just trying to come out, but I don't know what."
What that something was would soon come barreling towards the front of his mind like a freight train.
One night, Dan was watching a film called Communion. It was about a man in upstate New York who claimed to have been kidnapped by aliens. There was a particular scene where this little alien peeked out from behind the doorway. As soon as the scene came on, Dan just burst into tears and started shaking. He was hysterical. I came into the room to see what was wrong, and he told me, those eyes are what I saw."
Dan was referring to what had happened to them back in 1976. It was around a week later, while watching television again, that Dan saw a program that featured psychiatric therapist John Carpenter, who had worked quite extensively with people who claimed, or at least suspected, that they had been victims of alien abduction. Dan would contact Carpenter to see if he could help him piece together that night back in 1976. He would undergo hypnotic regression and was taken back to that evening. Dan would recall the following during that initial hypnosis session.
"There's a strange figure. It's showing me something."
Carpenter instructed Dan to take a good look at what it could be.
"It's something metallic, like a little spade. It's going to hurt."
Initially, Dan kept the details of the session to himself. However, a short time after beginning these sessions, Joyce began to have her own flashback recollections. In fact, more than just flashbacks.
The conscious memories just came back. There wasn't anything that I could do to stop them from coming back.
Following these sudden recollections, Joyce also visited Carpenter in order to undergo hypnotic regression. Carpenter would state the following.
Not only had the Ahrens likely had a traumatic abduction experience of some kind, but whatever it was, it seemed as though they were abducted together and at the same time.
And this, they would all learn, was only the beginning. After seeking help from abduction researcher John Carpenter, husband and wife Dan and Joyce Ahrens both went under hypnotic regression to retrieve memories of an event that took place in 1976. After both sessions, it was surmised that this was the couple's first, quote, shared abduction experience. Eventually, under hypnosis, the Ahrens began to piece together just what had happened that eventful night. Dan would recall the following.
"On that night in 1976, I was cowering in the corner of the bed. I was scared to death of something at the end of the bed. It was a little being of some sort. Then my eyes shot towards Joyce. There was another being, then another at the crib where Heather was sleeping."
Joyce would also recall seeing the three beings. One of them would touch her arm, making her spring up in bed. But what happened next did more than just startle her. It terrified her beyond belief.
They took Heather out of the crib. They took my baby and began to carry her away. Try as I might, I couldn't do anything. I was stuck in bed just watching in horror. It was like a kidnapper kidnapping your child and you can't do anything about it.
Dan would recall the same thing.
"I was overwhelmed with helplessness. I watched one of the beings head towards the crib. I didn't move. I didn't move. I couldn't move.
Then things took an even stranger turn. According to Joyce, both she and Dan were then marched outside by these strange beings before all of the family were floated onto a spaceship. While it was now clear that the entire Ahrens family had seemingly been subject to a harrowing alien abduction ordeal, it would be a further 5 years before Heather, now in her early 20s, agreed to also undergo hypnosis. And those revelations would be equally as startling. Carpenter would eventually offer that what Dan and Joyce had learned during their own hypnotic regression sessions, they had made a very special effort not to discuss any of it in front of their children. They both suspected that they too had been abducted by these beings, and they didn't wish to influence their own potential suppressed memories of the events. To begin with, Heather was a little dubious about hypnotic regression and if it would reveal anything of consequence. However, as soon as the session was underway, memories and flashes were at the forefront of her mind almost immediately. According to her mother, this is what she remembered.
She recalled one of the beings taking her out of her room and bringing her on board something. She could remember them asking if she wanted to play. They didn't speak, though. It was through Heather's mind that she could hear them. They wanted to play some sort of telepathic game with her. She told them that she didn't want to play and that all she wanted was to go home.
Whether it was a subconscious act of denial or not, the son, Daniel, despite the fact that he was repeatedly discovered asleep in different rooms of the house, believed that he had not been a part of any strange events. At the time, though, 2 decades after the 1976 night, he would offer that he believes something did happen to his parents and Heather. He also admitted that he was too scared to discover what memories he might have had. In fact, whenever his parents spoke about the encounter, even to themselves, Daniel found listening to the details too emotional. He would, though, eventually agree to undergo hypnotic regression himself. Carpenter would highlight the recurring dream that had plagued Daniel since he was a young child, stating that this dream would be an ideal exploration point, as it likely was triggered by suppressed memories of a real event.
After taking Daniel through the basics of hypnotic regression, including reassuring him that just because his family had recalled bizarre events didn't mean that he necessarily would, or that he would even be subjected to them, I took him back to his childhood where he was around 5 years old. Eventually, I would guide him to the recurring dreams, asking him where he was when the dream begins.
Here is Joyce relaying what Daniel believed to have happened.
Daniel recalled being in bed and hearing a noise that sounded like a can dropping. The sound was from the garage. He was so scared that he didn't want to look. He then suddenly realized that he was no longer in his room, but was somewhere completely different. A white, sterile, cold room. Then he saw 2 beings standing in front of him. He described them as tall and lanky with long fingers, big heads, and dark eyes. They had no hair and no ears.
At this point in the session, Daniel would recall the beings walking towards him. But something was of more concern than the beings simply moving closer. Joyce would relay what happened next, according to Daniel's recollections.
He remembered one of the beings have something in its hand, like a shiny stick or a wand. The being was making it move in front of Daniel and then placed the end of the wand on Daniel's head. He remembered it hurting when the being did this, and then everything went dark.
It was at this point that Carpenter had brought Daniel out from hypnosis. The entire session had lasted just under 2 hours long. Carpenter then asked Daniel one simple question that would yield an answer that proved to be anything but simple.
I asked Daniel if he believed all of it to have just been a dream. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and he said, "No, I don't believe it was a dream."
Carpenter also asked Daniel before the session about any strange marks, bruises, or cuts that he had suddenly noticed on his body, to which, according to his father, Daniel would state the following.
He did remember one specific time when he did discover something strange. He recalled waking up one morning and heading to the bathroom. However, that morning, he discovered this spoon-shaped mark on his left inner thigh. He immediately rushed downstairs to tell me. When he showed it to me, I was in shock, because I had an identical scoop-like mark in the same exact spot on my thigh.
It was clear that whatever had happened that night had happened to all of the Ahrens family. But it didn't end there.
Heather would eventually have a child of her own. Dan and I were now grandparents and learned the terrible truth that our grandchild had also been visited and possibly taken by these beings. My grandbaby would tell Heather that these little buddies would often come to play in his room with him, and that when they would leave, he would watch their ship fly away. Whatever was happening, whoever these beings were or wherever they came from, they seemed to be interested in our family through the generations. For whatever reason, we just don't know.
Could it be that these beings were interested in the genetics of the Ahrens family? Could those genetics have been pivotal to whatever agenda lay at the heart of these multi-generational alien abduction experiences? It should be noted that the contention when it comes to hypnotic regression is fierce. Many find benefit in the practice and hold high value on its outcomes, but just as many feel it to be complete bunk, and that the individuals who conduct the sessions, whether knowingly or not, will often ask leading questions of the person who is in a vulnerable position, both physically and, more importantly, mentally. Hypnotic regression therapist John Carpenter would state the following.
At no point had I led any of the Ahrens. This is something I pay very close attention to for the exact reason that many don't trust the use of hypnotic regression to begin with. I in no way influenced any of their responses, nor did I ever bring up anything prior to, during, or after each individual session about alien abductions, nor would I share anything that they said while under the regression. This was so that they would not influence one another. Now, obviously, I couldn't be with this family every second of every day to monitor whether they were discussing it with one another, but they specifically told me they were not, and I trusted them just as much as they trusted me to help them.
The other possibility that many skeptics would offer of this case was that the Ahrens had made the entire thing up. Again, Carpenter would state the following.
While it's not completely out of the question that this could be an elaborate hoax, it would greatly depend on the entire family all knowing what the trick questions were, a technique many practitioners use to filter out such things as lies or embellishments. So while not impossible, it would be highly, highly unlikely that 4 people would have been able to orchestrate such a hoax. And for what purpose? They never received any sort of monetary gain, nor did they ever go out of their way to be public about any of it. To me, the Ahrens family experienced something that they could not explain, and it affected each of them greatly. Their accounts, in my opinion, deserve the utmost respect and serious study.
After several interviews in the mid-1990s for the television series Sightings, it seemed that the Ahrens family no longer wished to speak about their experiences in public. So it was never truly known if these experiences continued thereafter. But Dan Ahren would briefly speak publicly in 2002 for a local newspaper article stating the following.
Both of our children suffered significant, long-lasting mental effects from these encounters. We had so much more to lose than to gain by speaking about any of this. But we did. And we can't change that.
Joyce, after her initial interactions and subsequent hypnosis sessions with John Carpenter, would tell him the following.
As a parent, you spend every waking moment trying to protect your children against all the dangers in the world. But what do you do when that danger not only can control your body and your mind, but possibly doesn't even come from this world?
No matter what did or didn't happen to the Ahrens family, it's quite clear that none of them were ever the same. If it was some sort of collective psychosis or hysteria, then that would be very unfortunate, to say the least. The same could be said if all of this was just a hoax. But if all of this was indeed real, if something came into the Ahrens home back in 1976 and abducted them, and continued to do so throughout the years and generations, then what was the true purpose of these experiences? And will the Ahrens, or we for that matter, ever truly know what lay behind the abduction phenomenon? Those answers, as always, seem to remain elusive somewhere in the skies. This episode was co-written by Marcus Loth. To learn more, visit ufoinsight.com. Special thanks to our voiceover talents in this episode: Amy Murphy, Andrew Sanford, and Brent Hand. You can find links to all of their work in the show notes. And you can follow us on Twitter @SomewhereSkies or on Instagram @SomewhereSkiesPod. Please take a moment to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us gain visibility and find new listeners. Special thanks to the E1 Podcast Network, and also a special thanks to you for listening. Remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.
Somewhere in the Skies is produced by Third Kind Productions in association with the Entertainment One Podcast Network.
I'm Ryan Sprague.
And I'm Andrew Sanford.
And we love pro wrestling.
It's the best.
Headlocks, elbow drops,
scathing promos, and chair shots.
We just can't get enough of it. So we started a podcast.
You can join Ryan and me as we dig into the ins and outs of pro wrestling like the rabid fans we are.
We've got interviews, previews, predictions, news, and so much more. And we're going to cover all of it on Somewhere in the Ring.
Oh, yeah.
Is that supposed to be Macho Man?
Nope, no good.
We'll work on it. Join us every Wednesday, wherever you get your podcasts, for all new episodes. And we'll see you somewhere in the ring.
Somewhere in the Ring is part of the E1 Podcast Network.